Diminished seventh chords and their application can be a confusing topic, but I'm going to show you 3 different ways that you can use them in your own chord progressions. So I always like to start my lessons off with some foundational info. We want to know where the chord comes from, the sound of it, how to play it, maybe a little more theory behind it. And we're gonna do that so we have something to stand on, and I'm not just saying play this and you say why, right? So we're going to learn about a diminished seventh chord, but you'll probably hear me say diminished from time to time. That's just because on the street, most of the time when somebody says it's a diminished chord, they mean a diminished seventh. It's just become commonplace, and that's the standard most of the time. So we'll be playing diminished seventh chords even if I slip up and say diminished from time to time. So let's start by building a C diminished seventh chord. And in this lesson, we're only going to use this fingering. There's other fingerings, 3 diminished seventh chords, many fingerings to play them. And that's because we want the theory and the knowledge and the understanding first. We can find other fingerings later, okay? So to build a diminished seventh chord, we stack minor third intervals on top of one another. So a minor third from C is E flat. A minor third from E flat is G flat. Now I'm saying flats, you can say sharps. I played in a lot of horn bands coming up, and all the sax players always talked in flat keys for the most part. So we have C to E flat, T sharp, or E flat, D sharp to G flat, F sharp. It's just easier to say flats. I'll probably keep doing that. G flat to A, and then we're back to the C, A to C. And you can even hear the sound of diminished start to happen. The diminished sound, or the diminished seventh sound, has that uneasy, spooky feeling, okay? And I always go and harken back to the old soap operas where somebody would play a diminished seventh chord on the organ, and it would be like real creepy, or a horror flick where Vincent Price would walk in, right? That's the sound. Get the sound in your head, okay? So when we want to cluster those intervals together, we want to put them in a chord shape, like that. Now, it's not in the order I went, but it has all the notes, and that's okay. It has a C, an E flat, a G flat, and an A. And that gives you the sound of a C diminished seventh chord, okay? Now, you can have, like any chord, as long as you have the notes you need, like a triad. If you have C, E, and G, major triad, E, G, C, major triad, it's the same thing. We're just inverting the notes. And any one of those notes in our C diminished seventh chord can actually be the root. So this could be called a G flat diminished. It could be called an E flat diminished. It could be called an A diminished 7, of course. And we also know that when we move that chord, a lot of us know, up to that minor third, we just invert the chord entirely, and it's still a C diminished 7 because now we have a C, E flat, A, and G flat, okay? More on that later and its value. But let's move that up a half step. Now we have a C sharp diminished 7. That's C sharp, G, B flat, and E. Again, don't beat me up on the accidentals. They can be whatever you prefer. Up another half step, D diminished 7. D, A flat, B, and then we have an F. Guess what? Those are the only 3 diminished seventh chords you're ever going to have. Because if we move one more half step, I previewed that earlier, we have E flat, A, C, and G flat. The same notes that are in the C diminished 7. The same thing would go here if I'm playing a C sharp. Those are all technically C sharp diminished 7th chords, or any of the notes in it can also be the root. In this particular shape, for my visual ease, I like to see that one is the root, but we're going to have another example where this will be our root as well, okay? Lots more to come. So now what we're going to do is create a chord progression that we can use this and insert it in a really fun way to practice. So the first thing we need to do is establish a chord progression, because we need a backdrop or something that we can insert these diminished 7th chords into, because these aren't the kind of chords you just hang on for measures and measures and play. That's generally not how they're used. They're used more as passing chords. They offer really fun chromatic movement and even substitutions for chords that you're going to play, which we'll do with this chord progression. And we're going to use the classic 2-5-1 chord progression in the key of C. Now, I'm going to sort of breeze by the theory on this because if you're learning about diminished seventh chords, you should already know about diatonic harmony and chord scales and that sort of thing. So just know that we're going to start, first of all, we want a C major 7. That's actually our 1. That's going to be the last chord we actually play. But that's the first chord in the key of C. And the second chord in the key of C can be a D minor 7 when harmonized with 4 notes. So we'll start with our D minor 7 from 1 measure, go down to the 5th degree of the scale, and we're going to play a G7. And that's going to be for 4 beats as well. But I don't want you to play this bar chord. I want you to try this shape. You can use a bar chord, it's fine, but our exercises forthcoming will really like this chord. And that's basically like a bar chord, but I switch the fingers up and I put the flat 7 F on the 2nd string, 6th fret there. So we have a D, G, B, and F. And then we play C major 7 for two measures. Okay, so it's gonna go a 1, 2, 3, 4, a 1, 2, 3, 4, a 1, 2, 3, 4 again. That's your D minor 7 to your G7 to your C major 7, 2, 5, 1 in C. Now, what we're going to do is talk about actually taking a diminished 7th chord and substituting it for one of those. So let's do that. Okay, so now we have our chord progression, and I want to talk about actually my favorite way to introduce a diminished 7th chord to my progression, and that is substituting it for a dominant chord. But you substitute it for a dominant chord a half step up from the root, okay? So we already know we have D minor 7, G7, and C major 7. So our dominant chord is our G7. And up a half step from it would be G sharp 7. But we want to make it diminished. So we use our shape. There's our G sharp right there. That's the note we need. And there's a D, a B, and an F. Be mindful of those. I'll explain in a moment. So now instead of this, we have this. A 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. See what I did there? I played G sharp diminished, G7 to C major 7. It's that really subtle one note move that makes it sound more sophisticated. Now here's the thing that's really interesting, is in music, many things have many names or angles that they can be viewed from, okay? When you take that G7 chord, our notes are G, B, D, and F. And then our G diminished 7, or G sharp diminished 7, excuse me, that we need for our substitution has the same notes except for the G sharp. But it's a really pretty way to use that chord and make your progression sound more interesting. Now, oftentimes, a chord like that, a G sharp diminished 7, will be called a G7 flat 9 because it has all the notes of a G7 chord. It has an F, flat 7, a B, 3rd, a D, the 5th. And that's another fingering we could use. But if you notice, that's an A flat, or your G sharp, of course. And that is the flat 9 of G. So if I had a G in the bass, that chord would read as a G7 flat 9. So there's two ways to think of the theory. I actually like thinking the half step up. That kind of helps me see a root, as opposed to saying, well, I got to play a flat 9 here and then a 7th here. I just think of it substitution, and there you go. Now, for you blues players, this is a great way to insert this into your blues playing when you're playing like a blues in G. Now, we won't play it on the 1 chord. 2. We go to the 4 chord, C9 maybe. You know, that kind of thing. So in the 4 chord there, you notice that I went C9, to a C sharp diminished. Same concept. Dominant chord, up a half step, play the diminished 7th, and you got it. So once again, our 2-5-1 normally. Now our 2-5-1 with our diminished 7th chord, up a half step from your dominant root. I love that one. Figured I'd start with my favorite. Let's try a couple more. So if you like this lesson in this style of teaching, I want to let you know that my course Rhythm Mastery contains these kinds of lessons and a whole lot more. The course really is about getting your strumming hand together and understanding rhythm, but then we bring in more complex chords, more sophisticated stuff. If you've never learned a major 7 or a minor 7 chord, that's in there too. And then you can start to add all this fun diminished stuff that we're going to work on later in today's lesson. But check out Rhythm Mastery. It's on sale for a deep discount in the links and in the comments, and let's try another one. Here we go. So another great way that we can use a diminished 7th chord is by playing a half step below a minor 7th chord. Think about all of these diminished movements as like approaches, okay? Our landing spot in this case is a D minor 7, and we want to approach it a half step below, so that means D flat or C sharp, diminished 7, and you hear how nicely that connects. So in the context of our 2-5-1 progression, you might hear something like this. We start on the D minor 7, a 2, a 3, 4, G7, C major 7, approach, now, what we can also do is add what we learned previously to it. So let's add in the G sharp diminished 7. So we could do D minor 7, G sharp diminished 7, G7, and then we're gonna approach again, 3, 4. Haha, that's for the next lesson. We're gonna talk about that. So you can approach a minor 7 chord from a half step below with a diminished 7th chord. And the thing is I don't want you to think about, I got to use this chord, I got to use this chord. It's totally at your, approval, at your discretion. That's the word I was looking for. You don't have to do this all the time. You hear the best players, the piano players, just kind of dropping in here and there. They might be playing. Never played a diminished chord. There's one there. You know it when you hear it. I mean, you might not even do it until the ending. And you start hearing things like that, right? So it's not a hard, fast rule. These are little colors that we can pull and use whenever we want. And even if we have a song that goes maybe C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, right? You can approach any of those minor 7s from a half step below diminished. Now you're sounding super fancy. Okay, there's one more little adjustment to this that I want to add. That's kind of the third way to use it, and we're going to do that next. Let's check that out. Okay, so I want to show you one more way that we can use a diminished 7th chord in a progression like this, or any kind of progression that you experiment with and feel that this application is indeed applicable, okay? And I really want to stress that because this isn't something you want to overuse, and you want to be really careful about the inversion and the voicing you use on the particular area of the guitar. Notice how they've all been very close, like that. We're not going all over the place and grabbing these chords. If you watch the greatest keyboard players ever, they always generally will keep their hands very close. Now, there's plenty of time they'll do this, but for these kinds of voicings and progressions, you hear them play these really close ones, okay? And that's what we want to be considering. Now, this final one is going to actually be built off of the 1, and we'll do a little substitution for the 1 chord, because we had our 2, our approach to the 2, our 5, and our approach that way, and then we have the 1. Now we stay on the 1 for 2 measures. A 1, 2, 3, 4, a 1, 2, back to the D minor 7. But we can do something with a diminished 7th chord there. We can play 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So we did a nice diminished 7 here, going into our D minor 7. Now why does this work? Well, we're going to replace the 1 chord with a 1 diminished 7. But notice I didn't do this one. Look how far away that is, even visually, and it just doesn't sound as good. So I'm playing this C major 7 for 2 measures, and in the second measure, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, look at that. You're gonna be like, well, isn't that an E flat? Diminished 7 and you're a half step above the D minor? Yeah, technically. But look, there's your C, and that C can be the root. And that's kind of what we're looking at, is how that C diminished 7 off of where the 1 would be gets us to our 2, okay? You'll hear that, and sometimes piano players will be going, you see, that's where we're headed, right? Is we can kind of just dab that chord in there every once in a while. It's not the one I would use the most, but it's definitely valid because we have our C major 7. We need to get to a D minor 7, so we're gonna play a C diminished 7. See, that sounds okay, but this sounds better. Because look, that A is already in common there, same note. Even the C, because that's the flat 7 of D minor. Okay, so substitute for the 1. Now, let's put it all together and play around with some other ideas. Now, once you have a little bit of a handle on this, you can start to play around with all sorts of ideas. You can start on the 2, and of course do our diminished, our 5 diminished substitution. Approach to the minor 7 chord with a half step below. Depending on how you know your chords, you can find them in different spots. So you can really start to play around with those ideas. There's the one for the C diminished 7 to the 2. Okay, so experiment, put it in your blues when you're playing that 4 chord. Go up a half step, try that. Find the moments that really work, and those moments are generally going to be before you change to another chord. Okay, keep your ears open, experiment, play some bad notes, play with the inversions, and just work on this shape right now, and then start experimenting with other ways to play a diminished 7th chord. And it's gonna be really, really helpful. Once I started to really understand these diminished 7th chords, I could see them popping up in my rhythm playing. But also, if you're playing a diminished chord, there is an opportunity to play a diminished scale or an arpeggio, and that's further down the line. But if the chord's there, the scale or the arpeggio exists as well. So keep that in the back of your mind. Learning a vocabulary like this on any instrument is a journey, and you got to stack days and stack knowledge, and it doesn't come all at once. That's for darn sure. This was a lesson that took me a while to get the thoughts together to say, this is a YouTube lesson. People don't have hours and hours to sit through stuff. They want the information quickly. So Corey, get your act together and put it together in a succinct way like they know you know how to do. Okay, and that's what I really wanted to do. So again, this kind of lesson and these concepts, even in some blues stuff, is all available in a recent course that I put out called Rhythm Mastery. This is a real comprehensive guide to rhythm guitar. Lots of chord stuff, but more importantly, it starts off very basic in getting your strumming hand involved too, and understanding how to read rhythms and lay that foundation so you're never shook about rhythm guitar, okay? There's many lessons on rhythm guitar studies. This course encompasses a lot of them and a lot of styles and genres and a lot that has to do with the rhythmic engine known as your strumming hand, okay? But there's plenty of the diminished stuff in there too, because once you learn chords, you got to make the chords go, and the chords go with an engine, and that's your strumming hand. And we put all that together in Rhythm Mastery. Get it for a really, really, really solid discount for you guys in the links below, because we want to take care of our YouTube family too. So sign up for that. If you just want to get the free PDF, you can enroll in my Best of YouTube series and get that for free as well. Links are in the comments and below. Thanks, guys. This is a really, really fun and informative lesson, and I hope you get a lot out of it. And let me know how you like to use diminished chords in the comments, and we'll see you next time.